Imagine waking up one morning to find out that your disabled mother has been illegally chained down in her own home. Not by some stranger, not by criminals, but by your neighborhood's homeowners association, the very people who are supposed to help keep your community safe and well-maintained. Sounds unbelievable, right? Almost like something out of a movie. But for one family, this nightmare was all too real. This all started in a quiet, upper-middle-class suburb. The kind of place where the lawns are always trimmed, the streets are clean, and everyone waves politely at each other. A neighborhood where you'd never expect anything strange to happen. It was the kind of place where people trusted the HOA to handle things like community rules, lawn care guidelines, and monthly newsletters, not human rights violations. The woman at the center of this story was someone's mother. She had been struggling with mobility issues for years. Her health had slowly declined, and by now she couldn't walk without assistance. She needed help with nearly everything: meals, medication, even getting out of bed. She relied on her son, who lived just a few streets over, to check in and take care of her. But for a few days, she stopped answering her phone. He thought maybe her battery had died, or maybe she was asleep. But something didn't feel right. He rushed over to her house. What he found made his heart drop. Her front door was locked from the outside with chains. Yes, actual chains. Not only that, but the back gate had been tied shut, and there were padlocks on the fence. It was like someone had tried to turn her home into a prison. He called 911. The police arrived and forced their way in. Inside, the scene was even worse. His mother was lying on a couch, barely conscious. She hadn't eaten in over a day. Her phone had been taken away. She had no way of calling for help. The air was stuffy, the windows were shut, and there were signs that she hadn't been able to reach the bathroom in time. No person should ever be treated like that, especially not someone so vulnerable. As the police questioned neighbors and looked for answers, a few people pointed fingers at the HOA. One neighbor claimed he saw an HOA board member with a bolt cutter and a toolbox near the house a few days before. Another said there had been arguments between the family and the HOA about property conditions. Apparently, the board had issued several warnings about the mother's yard, saying it violated community standards. There were also complaints about her needing assistance with trash pickup and mailbox access. But none of that could possibly justify what happened next. It didn't take long for word to spread. Local news outlets picked up the story. But then, something strange happened. A federal agent showed up at the HOA office. Not a local cop. Not a state investigator. Someone from the FBI. That's when the whole story took a darker turn. What started as a neighborhood dispute suddenly looked like something much bigger. Behind the scenes, the FBI had already been keeping an eye on this HOA.
Why?
Because of multiple complaints about harassment, threats, and even illegal surveillance. It turns out this wasn't the first time this group had taken extreme measures against a resident. In fact, they had a pattern. People with disabilities, elderly homeowners, and low-income families were all being targeted. They were fined repeatedly, threatened with eviction, and pressured to sell their homes. Documents started surfacing. Emails, meeting notes, even private text messages between board members. It became clear that this wasn't some one-time mistake or misunderstanding. This was planned. The HOA had overstepped in ways no one thought possible, and they thought they could get away with it. They had no idea that federal agents were quietly building a case. Neighbors began speaking up. Some admitted they were scared to say anything before, afraid they'd be targeted next. One resident said she had been warned not to associate with the woman's family. Another revealed that she had cameras installed by the HOA without her permission. The more people talked, the worse it looked for the board. And while all of this was unfolding, the woman, someone's mother, was still recovering. Still trying to process the fact that people in her own neighborhood had done this to her. People she used to wave at. People who had once offered to help with groceries or yard work. She trusted them. And they turned her home into a cage. But that wasn't the end. In fact, it was just the beginning. The deeper the investigation went, the stranger things got. At first, it looked like a terrible case of overreach, an HOA board taking things too far with a disabled resident. But as more details started to come out, it became clear this wasn't just a bad decision. It was something more intentional, more organized, almost like they had a plan. The woman's son, who had found her chained inside her house, couldn't stop asking questions. Who gave the order? Why would anyone go this far just to enforce neighborhood rules? When he requested the HOA's official communications, they stalled. He was told he had to submit formal paperwork, wait 30 days, and pay a processing fee. That didn't sit right with him. So he started knocking on doors. One by one, neighbors began telling him their stories. An elderly man who used a walker had been fined hundreds of dollars because he couldn't bring in his trash bin within 24 hours. A single mother was written up for having her car parked a few inches off the driveway. A man with a chronic illness said he got a violation notice every week for grass that was supposedly too tall, even though he had just mowed it. These weren't just one-off incidents. They formed a pattern. Every time it was someone vulnerable, someone who couldn't easily fight back. And every time, the HOA acted like they were simply following the rules. But then came the most disturbing part. The woman's son managed to get a look at some of the internal emails exchanged between board members. What he found shocked him. In one message, a board member joked about finally getting rid of the problem on Elm Street, referring to his mother. Another called her house an eyesore and asked if they could take care of it quietly. One email even asked if the board could legally have someone removed for being a burden on community image. That's when he realized this wasn't about grass or fences or trash bins. This was personal. The police had already launched a case, but the FBI's interest changed everything. Agents weren't just looking at one incident. They were building a case around abuse of power, civil rights violations, and possibly even conspiracy. They pulled security camera footage, phone records, and documents from HOA meetings going back years. They interviewed dozens of residents. And every time they uncovered one piece of the puzzle, it pointed to something darker. One of the most chilling discoveries was a handwritten notebook found in the HOA president's desk. Inside were names. Lots of them. People who had caused problems, according to the notes. Each name had a list of actions taken against them. Fines, letters, citations, threats of foreclosure. Some even had checkmarks next to them, as if they'd been handled. Meanwhile, the woman who had been chained inside her own house was trying to recover. She'd been moved to a safe location, away from the neighborhood. But she was still shaken. She couldn't understand why people she'd lived near for years would treat her like this. All she had wanted was to live quietly, take her medications, watch her shows, and spend time with her son. Now, she was afraid to sleep with the lights off. The FBI's presence stirred up the entire neighborhood. Suddenly, people who had stayed silent for years were willing to talk. They realized they weren't alone. That maybe, just maybe, speaking out would make a difference this time. A local reporter started following the story closely. He met with the family, attended HOA meetings, and even tried to question board members. Most of them refused to speak. One quit suddenly and left the state. Another lawyered up and denied any involvement. Still, the evidence was piling up. And then something unexpected happened. A whistleblower from inside the HOA came forward. She had been a secretary for the board for over 2 years. She said she had seen everything, and she had copies, meeting recordings, email backups, notes from private conversations. She claimed she stayed silent because she needed the job. But after what happened to the woman, she couldn't hold it in anymore. She handed everything over to the FBI. And just like that, the case took on a whole new level of seriousness. What had started with one woman and one house had now become a full-blown federal investigation into corruption, discrimination, and targeted abuse inside a neighborhood organization. And people were finally paying attention. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. After the whistleblower handed over her evidence, the FBI moved fast. Agents returned to the neighborhood, but this time they weren't just asking questions. They had search warrants. They entered the HOA office and carried out boxes of files, laptops, hard drives, and even the HOA president's personal safe. By now, everyone on the street was talking. Windows cracked open as people peeked out. Some were curious. Others looked relieved. A few looked worried. The news spread like wildfire. Local stations ran the story nonstop. Headlines read, HOA corruption scandal uncovered, and FBI raids suburban board office. For many in the neighborhood, this was the first time they realized just how deep the problem had gone. Some had thought the HOA was just strict. Others believed the rules were meant to protect property values. But now, those same rules looked more like tools of control. And the people who enforced them weren't community-minded volunteers. They were acting like bullies with power. As files were reviewed and digital data decrypted, more shocking discoveries came to light. There were transcripts from private conversations, recordings where board members discussed ways to push certain people out of the community. In one audio clip, a member said, "We don't want sick people making the place look depressing." Another voice followed with, "Let's just keep the pressure up. They'll either sell or disappear." These weren't just cruel comments. They were strategies. Strategies used over and over again. The same tactics repeated, with the same types of people targeted. People who were disabled, elderly, or struggling financially. People who couldn't afford lawyers. People who didn't fight back. The woman at the center of the story, quiet, disabled, and defenseless, fit their pattern exactly. The FBI found that the board had been using a combination of aggressive fines, false reports, and forced property inspections to wear people down. In one case, a veteran with PTSD was fined over $4,000 in 6 months for unapproved decorations on his porch. In another, a family caring for their autistic son was repeatedly threatened with foreclosure over minor landscaping issues. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, it was exploiting people. Public anger exploded. Community meetings that were once boring and half-empty were now packed. Residents who had stayed silent for years stood up and spoke. One woman said she had lived in fear of retaliation for planting the wrong type of flowers. A man admitted he once stopped speaking to his elderly neighbor because the HOA warned him not to get too close to the complainers. The atmosphere in the neighborhood had been tense for years, but no one had realized just how calculated it all was. Outside the community, legal experts began weighing in. Some said the HOA had likely violated federal housing laws. Others pointed out potential hate crime charges, depending on the motivations behind the targeting. Civil rights attorneys began circling the case, offering to represent victims. What began as a quiet investigation had now become a national example of how unchecked authority can spiral into full-blown abuse. And then, the arrests began. The HOA president was taken into custody first, charged with multiple counts including unlawful imprisonment, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. 2 other board members were arrested shortly after. Their mugshots made the evening news. For the first time, the victims saw actual consequences. For the first time, people believed justice might be possible. Meanwhile, more victims came forward. Stories poured in from nearby communities. It seemed that this HOA wasn't alone. Other neighborhoods were facing similar issues, tight-knit boards acting without oversight, punishing residents for arbitrary reasons, and hiding behind vague community bylaws. The problem was bigger than anyone had imagined. But back in the original neighborhood, the mood had shifted. The same people who once nodded politely at board meetings were now demanding change. They called for a complete restructuring of the HOA. Some pushed for its total removal. Others suggested an independent watchdog group to prevent abuse from happening again. Everyone seemed to agree on one thing: this could never be allowed to happen again. The woman, whose suffering had sparked it all, remained out of the public eye. Her son said she was still shaken, still processing what had happened, but she was safe. People in the community began sending letters of support. Meals were delivered. Strangers apologized for not doing more. For the first time in a long while, the neighborhood started to feel human again. Not perfect, not completely healed, but different. The neighborhood looked the same on the outside. Same houses, same driveways, same rows of trees that lined the sidewalks. But something felt different now. It wasn't just the absence of the old HOA board. It was the way people looked at each other. There was a quiet shift, a shared understanding. People who once lived side by side, without ever speaking, now nodded as they passed. Some even stopped to talk. The silence that had filled the neighborhood for years was slowly being replaced by something new. The temporary committee formed after the vote was already making progress. They weren't professional leaders. Most of them had no experience running anything. But they were neighbors. They listened. They took notes. They admitted when they didn't have answers. And somehow, that made people trust them more than the polished, rule-heavy board that came before. The new members held open meetings, invited questions, and made every document available for anyone who wanted to see it. Even residents who had never attended a single meeting before were now showing up. One of the first things the committee did was set up a community survey. They asked simple questions. What rules felt unfair? What would you change? What kind of help do you need? The responses came in by the dozens. Some were thoughtful, others emotional. One elderly woman wrote, "I just want to put up a bird feeder without getting fined." A young dad said, "My daughter has a disability, and I'm tired of feeling watched every time she plays outside." One line that stood out more than any other simply said, "Can we just feel like neighbors again?" That became the committee's unofficial motto. At the same time, the legal process moved forward behind the scenes. The former HOA president had hired a high-profile attorney, and the court hearings began quietly. News vans still parked at the edge of the neighborhood, but the chaos of early headlines had faded. Most people inside the community weren't following every legal detail. They were focused on rebuilding. Not just fences or landscaping, but trust. The kind that had been stripped away over years of fear and silence. The woman who had sparked the movement was still living in a care facility outside town. Her health had improved, but she was still fragile, physically and emotionally. Her son visited often, sometimes bringing cards and letters from neighbors who had never met her but felt connected to her story. He read them aloud. Messages from strangers who said things like, "You opened our eyes," or "You made us speak up." She didn't say much in response, but she listened. Every single time. Her story had started as one of isolation, but now it was part of something much bigger. The neighborhood also began working with outside organizations, civil rights groups, disability advocates, and legal experts who offered guidance on how to make the community safer and more inclusive. Workshops were held in the local library. One focused on recognizing subtle discrimination. Another helped people understand their rights under fair housing laws. They weren't mandatory. No one was forced to attend, but the rooms filled up anyway. Something else happened, too, something no one expected. Other neighborhoods started reaching out. Communities from other cities sent emails asking how they'd made the change. Some were dealing with similar problems: strict boards, hidden abuse, silence from scared residents. The temporary committee began sharing their story. Not because they wanted attention, but because they knew what it felt like to think you were alone. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the residents started noticing something simple but powerful. They weren't afraid anymore. They could put up decorations without double-checking the rules. They could help each other without wondering if someone would report them. They could walk their dogs, sit on their porches, speak up at meetings, and not feel like targets. That freedom, once taken for granted, now meant everything. The old HOA board was gone, but the scars they left behind remained. People hadn't forgotten, but instead of avoiding the past, they were using it as a lesson, as a reminder, as a reason to keep things open and honest. Some wounds don't heal fast, but they do remind you where to be careful next time. And slowly, step by step, the neighborhood wasn't just recovering. It was transforming, not into something perfect, not into something flawless, but into something real. As the days passed, it became clear that the HOA scandal had left a permanent mark, not just on the neighborhood, but on the people living in it. What was once a quiet, picture-perfect street had become the center of a nationwide conversation. Camera crews showed up daily. Reporters knocked on doors. Legal experts appeared on talk shows, using the case as a warning about unchecked power in local communities. But behind all the media buzz, life in the neighborhood had changed in quieter, deeper ways. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now talking openly. At first, it was just small talk, greetings, nervous jokes, awkward silences. But then the stories came out. Real ones. A retired teacher admitted, She had been fined repeatedly for a broken fence she couldn't afford to fix. She had been too embarrassed to tell anyone. A young couple who moved in last year revealed they were warned by a board member to keep a low profile because they looked like renters. They weren't renters. They had bought the house with their life savings. People began to understand something important. This wasn't just about one woman or one HOA board. This was about fear. Quiet fear. The kind that keeps people silent. The kind that makes you second-guess speaking up because you don't want to become a target. That fear had allowed the abuse to go on for years. And now, people were tired of living with it. More residents started attending community meetings, and for once, they weren't just listening. They were challenging, asking questions, demanding answers. The few remaining board members, the ones who hadn't been arrested, looked uncomfortable under the spotlight. They tried to calm the crowd, saying things like, "We didn't know," or "We were just doing our jobs." But those excuses didn't land the way they used to. Then came the moment that many residents had been waiting for. A group of them, led by the woman's son and the former board secretary who had blown the whistle, filed a formal motion to dissolve the existing HOA leadership. They argued that the board had violated its duties, lost the trust of the community, and failed to protect its most vulnerable residents. More than 2/3 of the neighborhood signed the petition. It was enough to force a vote. The meeting that night was packed wall to wall. Folding chairs were set up in the community center, but there still wasn't enough space. People stood in the aisles, leaned against walls, some even waited outside by the windows. The atmosphere was tense. But it wasn't angry, it was focused, determined. People were ready for change, and they weren't going to let the moment pass. One by one, residents stood and spoke. Some talked about fines. Others shared stories about harassment or bullying. And some just spoke about how they had stopped feeling safe in their own homes. The woman's son stood last. He didn't yell. He didn't blame. He just asked one question. "How many of you thought you were alone?" Silence followed. Then hands began to raise, dozens of them. The vote passed overwhelmingly. The old board was officially removed. A new, temporary committee was formed, made up of volunteers from the community. Their first promise was transparency. No more secret meetings. No more vague letters. No more silence. Outside the meeting hall, something unexpected happened. Neighbors who had once ignored each other now stayed behind to talk. People who had never introduced themselves shook hands, exchanged numbers, even hugged. For the first time in a long time, the street didn't feel divided. It felt united. Not because they all agreed, but because they had finally faced the truth together. Meanwhile, the FBI continued its investigation. More files were being reviewed. Charges were still being considered. And the legal process, slow as always, kept moving forward. But in the neighborhood itself, people weren't waiting anymore. They were taking small steps, repainting mailboxes, fixing fences, helping elderly neighbors take out the trash. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about looking out for each other. The woman who had suffered so much still hadn't returned to her home. Her son said she wasn't sure she ever would. Too many memories. Too much pain. But she knew what had changed. She knew people were watching now. Listening. Caring. And maybe, for the first time, she felt like she wasn't alone either.